I welcome you to Amrut Mody School of Management, Ahmedabad University. This is a conversation series, and in this series, we invite an eminent speaker, and we have a conversation with our in-house professor. Today, we have a very exciting panel, and you all know, I mean, he needs no introduction, but it is my privilege to introduce you, sir. So, Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta is a professor of political science and former Vice-Chancellor, Ashoka University. He was previously President, Center for Policy Research. He has been a professor at Harvard, JNU, the Global Faculty Program at NYU Law School. He has published widely in political theory, constitutional law, society, and politics in India, governance, political economy, and international affairs. These are the topics on which he writes often, in fact, every week. His most recent publications include the Oxford Handbook to the Indian Constitution and Rethinking India's Public Institution, Non-Alignment 2.0, the Oxford Companion to Politics in India, India and Multilateralism, and the Burden of Democracy. He has also served in a number of policy roles, including member convener of the Prime Minister of India's National Knowledge Commission, member of the National Security Advisory Board, member of Lingdo Committee. He chairs the jury for the Holberg Prize. He has a prolific engagement with public affairs. We all know that. He is an editorial consultant to Indian Express, where he writes a regular column. In addition, he has written for the Financial Times and number of leading national and international publications. He is on the editorial board of American Political Science Review and the Journal of Democracy. Recently, in 2011, he got Infosys Prize for Social Sciences, Political Science in the field of political science. We are thrilled to have you, Professor Mehta, at Ahmedabad University. Welcome you. Uh, the person who will be in conversation with Professor Mehta is our own Professor Ravi Miglani. He's a professor of practice of management, and he has a 35 years of experience in the field of marketing and research and consumer insight. He has worked across multiple domains in market research, and he joined Ahmedabad University in 2019, and he has been one of the main force behind this conversation series. So without further delay, I request both of you to begin the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Sudhir, and welcome again, Pratap. It is really great to have you. As Sudhir's introduction would have told all of us, that Pratap is a prolific writer and speaker on a very wide range of topics, from politics to economics to public policy to philosophy and beyond. So I'm sure Pratap can hold forth for hours on these topics without me being needed. The only reason I'm here is so I can kind of steer and because we don't have many hours, we have just about an hour. So I'll try and steer and keep our conversation within our framework. But I'm sure Pratap doesn't need questions for him to talk on this topic. Pratap, just to start us off, having said that, my role is to kind of keep the framework around this discussion. What I will do is throw up a few stories and theories which people say why India will become a global leader, and equal number of theories on why India will not become a global leader. And my role will be to some extent to play the devil's advocate. So I'll provoke you by throwing these theories, and you can agree to them or refute them. But knowing you, I don't think you need provoking, but I'll still provoke you to talk about some of these. So the first thing that comes to mind whenever we talk about India becoming a global power or a world leader is this phrase that people bandy around, saying Indian exceptionalism, that India has always been great. India is a 5,000-year-old civilization. It is India's destiny to lead the world. Without saying how specifically we will plan to lead the world, we believe that it is our birthright to lead the world because we are a 5,000-year-old civilization, and that for most of those 5,000 years we were great. There are figures bandied around. Economists may agree or disagree that India was kind of 25% of the world's GDP until a couple of hundred years ago, and then the colonial period messed it all up and left us with 2% of world's GDP instead of 25% of world's GDP. But no worries, we'll get back where we belong. Does this story hold water? Do you believe that it is India's destiny to be great, and the last 200 years or so were just an aberration, and we'll get back where we belong?
First of all, it's a great privilege being here, and I'm sure I'll learn a lot from this conversation. Thank you, Raviji, and everybody else at Ahmedabad University for organizing it. And my only regret about this conversation is that we are not doing it in person on campus. It would have been so much more invigorating and fun. Your question, look, we can run these lines back and forth. I mean, the other story, India's always been the country of the future and will always remain so, right? It's the flip side of this 5,000-year history. But I think to get serious about it, I mean, I think three things, initially. One, I think, of course, we have to define the parameters of greatness. I mean, what the yardsticks are. But let's take a very conventional yardstick, right? Which is what usually people have in mind when they think about greatness is the net sort of power, in some senses, a country or a civilization has. And then there are various indexes about how you measure these powers, right? Economic power, cultural power, and so forth. No, there's no question that India was an extraordinary civilization. I mean, I don't think anybody denies that fact. Whether we were exceptional in some ways, I think is much more debatable. We like to bandy about this figure that we were 20% of the, world economy before colonialism, modern colonialism took over. Broadly speaking, that's right. The part we forget about that figure is that in those days, your proportion of the world economy pretty much tracked demography. So 1800 world population of 1 billion, we were about 180 million. Bingo, you're 20%. Okay, so I think these are very comforting, which is not to say that we were not to die. I mean, there is certainly a rupture that colonialism creates that absolutely devastates India's positioning in the world economy. But I think on the economy side, frankly, we have a long way to go, and the real story really begins after the 1800s, right? The second thing, I think, which is the most important thing about having a 5,000-year-old civilization, is that it's an asset if you have a sense of humor, and it's a liability that if you don't. I mean, it's like managing a, very extended joint family without a sense of humor. And unfortunately for us, I think most of our recent history, this sense of depth and complexity is being carried around as a burden, and it's not being carried around lightly, right? I mean, it's like the feeling you get at the end of reading the Mahabharata, that you've had stories within stories, akhyans, upakhyans, and everybody comes out of it very heavy. So the question for us is, how do you take this continuity, this choice of inheritance that we have, in a way that actually becomes an asset for the present and the future, rather than a burden that weighs us down? And I think the way we are defining our identity, the way we have constructed our political and historical conflicts, we are still trapped in the quicksand of that supposedly deep history. And in a way, we need to think of how we come out of it. The third and final point, I mean, this is a very simple one, which is what of the future? I mean, Nehru used this nice phrase, tryst with destiny, right? Part of what he wanted to suggest was that there's something paradoxical about destiny, which is you are fated to be something, right? But in some senses, you have to work to realize your own destiny. And the question for us is our political and economic project being imagined in ways that can actually realize this potential? If you look at the Lowy Great Power Index, Lowy is this think tank from Australia that does one of the best great power indexes, I think, around as far as these things go. One thing that emerges very starkly is that India is one of the countries where the gap between potential and achievement is absolutely extraordinarily high, right? So we score very high on potential. We score relatively low on achievement. And the question is, how are we going to bridge this gap?
Yeah, which is what, so, I mean, if I understand you right, I mean, having this civilization is also having a weight of this civilization, and we are not able to decide whether we want to shake off that weight of 5,000 years and start afresh, or we want to use that as an asset or as a liability. So we have an old civilization, but as V.S. Naipaul, for example, instead of calling it an old civilization, he used to call it a wounded old civilization. So are we a wounded old civilization and we should move on from that, or we hang on to that old civilization? So what that sometimes leads to this belief, again, I'm being a devil's advocate, but a belief that because of all of that history and all of that civilization, that we will be a world power and not become a world power. I'm using the words be and become as in being more of an action verb. To become a world power, we need to do a lot of things, economy wise, military wise, soft power wise, diplomacy wise, and so on. So instead of trying to become a world power, we are just sitting there hoping that we will be a world power because that is our destiny. Do you think that we are more hoping to be a world power rather than actively trying to become one?
I mean, look, I think it's a matter of interpretation. I mean, because one of the accusations against India is that there's neither being nor becoming, that we are actually very under-ambitious, given the assets we have, the talent we have, the resources we have, and the potential we have. Yes, Indian elites like to talk about, becoming a world power or being a world power. But frankly, if you look at the goals we set ourselves, right, they're actually still relatively modest, aim low, hit lower, as it were, or achieve lower. So, there is the point of view that actually argues that India's problem is neither, that it's not that it's, thinks of itself as a great power or it's trying to become one. It is as it was sort of lost in its own pace, as it were, in time. Once in a while, we trot out these great power dreams, dil behlane ko galib khayal acha hai, in almost that spirit. But there hasn't been a political articulation of that project that was commensurate with the ambition, right? That both of these phases, whether you say are we a great power or are we becoming a great power, exhibits. You mentioned Naipaul, and I think Naipaul is interesting. I mean, I think and had, I think, one very keen insight, which I think pertains to your question, that when he described India as a wounded civilization, right, he obviously had in mind the historical fact of subjugation and the psychological trauma that he thought subjugation had produced on a kind of colonized people, which we still hadn't worked out. Right? But he was not referring just in a sense to an external fact. In fact, I think one way of capturing what he had in mind when he called India a wounded civilization, right, was that trauma, or whatever you want to call it, or our sense of trauma, actually was disabling us from acting as agents who can make our own history. In fact, remember, his point was that India is such a wounded civilization, it doesn't even care about its past. Even this question of, continuity with a 5,000-year-old, 4,000-year-old civilization, it's a gesture, it's a performative continuity, right? This is a civilization marked by, like most civilizations are, with deep continuities and breaks. But we were so wounded, we were not even interested in our own history, right? We were so wounded that we could not imagine what a ambitious collective project of freedom and emancipation would look like. And what upset him about India in the first book, The Wounded Civilization, was that inebriated spirit. So and I think he was on to something. I think he caught that complexity, I think, much better than almost any other writer. That if you think of societies that aspire to be great powers, and we should debate whether we should aspire to be a great power and what that means separately. But if you think in those conventional terms, there was actually no evidence of the seriousness or aspiration that would lie behind such an ambition.
Yeah, and so which is what sometimes when I see these very kind of effusive talk of India was great, India will become great because it was great. It in lightheartedly, it reminds me of these ads that I see often for mutual funds and other such financial institutions, where there is this risk factors page which they read out at 100 words per second saying past performance is not an indicator of future returns. So in India's case, I think we are stuck in that situation, and we should keep reminding ourselves that past performance is not an indicator of future returns. And we need to do something and look and analyze the future rather than keep talking about the past. Another I'm sure familiar with Aparna Pandey of Hudson Institute. She, in her recent book, calls India a reluctant world power, which is, as you were just saying, that there is not a sense of urgency that we need to do something to become a world power, and not even a sense of certainty that we do want to become a world power. There's this ambivalence on whether we do want to become a world power or just stay happy where we are. So would you agree with that phrase, reluctant world power? Are we reluctant?
So there are two things. One, unlike in mutual funds, I think it's fair to say in civilizations, it's the future returns that determine what your past returns were. If a civilization does well, everybody says, oh, this is long depth continuity. When China was doing terribly, everything used to be blamed on Chinese culture, remember? And now suddenly, China becomes a glorious culture. Same is, by the way, true of India in some ways, right? Which is if India becomes a prosperous society governed by democracy and justice, in retrospect, this will look like a much more glorious civilization, right? So in that sense, I think how we interpret past civilizations is a function of the present. Coming to a more substantive question, is India a reluctant power? So I think we have to get some basics right in place first, which is let's remind ourselves that India still faces immense challenges. It's an enormously poor country. You're looking at per capita incomes of still, $2,000 roughly. Obviously, because of its size and its population, it does have an imprint on world affairs, right? But the interesting question is, should a country with this level of economic impoverishment still, right? What should, in a sense, its priorities be? And as far as I'm concerned, the single biggest goal India needs to pursue when it looks at how to engage with the world is, what will give it maximum room for development, right? And development defined in two very specific ways, which is one in terms of objective Gandhi's terms, which is what is it actually going to do for India's poor, how it's going to economically empower every last citizen and give them an opportunity to participate in the economy. And second, as a zone of freedom, which is a absolutely extraordinary, unique experiment, right? In diversity, that is a unprecedented zone of individual freedom, liberty, liberty, equality, fraternity in some senses. That project has to define India's aspirations. And if India succeeds in both of these, right, it automatically becomes a great power. Our best foreign policy is an 8% growth rate, right? Let's be very clear on that. The most important signal of our credibility in the world will be the credibility and justice of our political system, right? All great powers become great powers because there is a power of an idea behind them in some ways, right? Think of Roman civilization, if you think of the United States. And so there is no question of India being reluctant or not reluctant. Our countries become great powers because there is a kind of momentum. And our momentum on these two dimensions, let's put it this way, has been more patchy than it should be. I think our democracy was a great asset, which looks like we are now very impatient about and would like to fritter away. And our economic growth and economic trajectory, right, our development model, has simply not yet delivered the kind of momentum where you can have the footprint in the world that a great power would require.
True. That kind of leads me to another kind of, again, being a devil's advocate. There is this tension I see very often reading about people's kind of divergent views on where is India's headed and what is India's destiny. There's kind of a contradiction or a dichotomy. Some people believe that India is still kind of stuck in the colonial imperialism hangover and Swadeshi and the Nehru style kind of self-reliance and socialism and Gandhi style. India lives in its villages and back to the villages, and being kind of suspicious of big business and suspicious of trade because trade will bring the colonials back, and in a new avatar we'll have imperialists back in under the guise of trade as the East India Company did 300 years ago. So there is that suspicion of opening up and becoming a great power because the last time it hurt us. And on the other hand, the need to move forward and do that. Do you see that as a contradiction, or is it not a contradiction?
So a couple of things about it. It's an interesting question. To be honest, I do think India is a lot more confident than it was 30, 40 years ago. And frankly, the material circumstances have changed. I mean, I think people always criticize our economic policies in the 1950s, but remember, 1950s, you inherited independence with a severe balance of payments crisis. You had a very small domestic bourgeoisie, right, to, in some senses, build with. You had a very small capital base, right? You had just come out of two of the most extraordinary traumas a country can witness, partition and the Great Bengal famine, right? And under those circumstances, we made, particular kinds of economic choices. Now, as far as I see it, I think at this juncture, if we think of India's approach to globalization, right, it has the following components. One, to be honest, this approach is not being driven either way, whether we want to integrate into the world economy or whether we want to, in some senses, do Atmanirbhar Bharat or relatively withdraw. The drivers of the decisions that we are taking are not objectives of planning or objectives of achieving great power status. The drivers are frankly our own political economy. Which interests domestically are served by which decisions? Okay? So when we globalized, 1991, at least in principle, a decision that greater integration into the world economy is going to be good for India. The obvious question to ask was, what are the conditions you need to put in place to make this integration into the global economy work for you? Okay? Now, here's the irony. I actually think that integration into the global economy, on balance, was much better for India than the previous regime. I mean, we actually did pull out more people of poverty during that period than any other period. For a decade, we achieved 7.5%, 8% growth. There was a paradigm shift that in a sense, it was inaugurating. But what led, in some senses, to doubts about that model? It wasn't any deep psychological angst about opening up. It wasn't the hostility of the rest of the world. It was our own political economy. So, number one, finance, right? India's integration into the global economy was very paradoxical because we actually prematurely favored financial globalization over, in some senses, trade, right? Over, in some senses, FDI. Why? Because our domestic institutions, right, simply were not optimally designed to fulfill the financing needs of the country. Now, for a country that wanted to actually export, right, this over-reliance on finance is a paradoxical thing, right? It distorts your exchange rates. You didn't ask the question that China did, that if you want a competitive export economy, right, what should, in a sense, be the sequencing in terms of the relationship between finance and trade, right? Right now, we are, for example, thinking of building national champions as part of Atmanirbhar Bharat, right? Mega companies, right? That's part of our crony capitalist model, okay? Our mega companies, Reliance, Jio, are going to be in non-tradable sectors, right? Is this a sustainable model of Atmanirbhar? Okay? When do we allow remittances? What our exchange rate policies are? All of those things have not been determined by a consistent architecture. Okay, we want to integrate. How do we make this integration successful? They've actually been dictated by piecemeal interests, capturing the state, right, and directing its policy piecemeal. Why was there skepticism about the 1991 model, right? This kind of implicit backlash? Two very simple things. We did not reform factor markets in our domestic political economy, and most people became convinced that this so-called liberalization, politically at least as compatible with a form of crony capture, right, as anything else. Liberalization promised us, right, a decrease in crony capitalism. Okay? So our real challenge is not the psychological challenge. Are we ready to take on the world? Do we have the confidence? The real challenge is, can we fix the domestic political economy that stands in the way of success, whichever model you choose? Let's say you want to go the Atmanirbhar way, right? Then are you going to invest in the kind of R&D that you actually need to invest in? Are you actually going to make sure that your higher education system is actually cutting edge in the world? Are you going to be receptive enough to an open, vibrant, contested higher education space where India can become an alternative low-cost hub for higher education in the world, right? Now, if you're not going to globalize that, if you're not going to be receptive in that sector, if you're not going to invest in R&D, there's no point talking about Atmanirbhar Bharat, right? So, and there the obstacles are frankly our political economy. It's nothing to do with psychological obstacles or the external world being hostile.
Talking of psychological obstacles, another psychological obstacle that I often read about, and you read about, I'm sure, and write about, is there's this belief that India culturally and socially, India doesn't like wealth and capitalism, and India disdains. There's this whole culture of money is bad and simple living, high thinking, and we should not be ostentatious. Rich people are bad people. That kind of culture is traditionally been there. and romanticizing poverty and all of that. I mean, there's this quotation attributed to Nehru. I don't know whether he said it. It's believed that he said to J.R.D. Tata once, "Don't use the word profit in my presence. Profit is a dirty word." So, if profit is a dirty word and being wealthy is not a great thing, how do we reconcile that with the crony capitalism and the so-called bad boy billionaires that we are mushrooming around the country? Mhm.
So look, I have never bought this idea, trawling through all our texts, our rich cultural history, that India was hostile to the creation of wealth. I mean, look, Lakshmi is worshipped more than almost in any other country. And even the strain of renunciation, I agree that there is a strain of renunciation, right? The Nivritti Marg is very widely in some senses prescribed. But remember, even for renunciation, you have to first earn something to renounce it. Right, in some senses, and like a lot of sort of Jain traders and so forth do, right? So to be honest, I actually don't buy that there is this sort of cultural romanticization of poverty. And if there is a cultural romanticization of poverty, by whom? Right? Not by 90 to 95% of India's population that actually wants to see its next generation better than they're doing, right? I think the issue on that is different, and I think it comes from two different sources. One, I think very frankly, from the caste system, where the hold of this insidious form of hierarchy in Indian civilization meant that no matter what we did, whether we said we want to generate wealth, whether we want to spread education, right? In the imagination of our elites, only a very small section of population was included in those endeavors, right? Did anybody even ask poor people, right? Do you want to continue living in this poverty before romanticizing them? In fact, I think, what it suggests is a kind of deep exclusion, social exclusion, that was at the base of Indian society, right? And frankly, that's something that's still plaguing our development model in deep and different ways. Forget, about the accumulation of profit, right? In terms of basic human dignity and livelihood, manual scavenging should be an offense, whether or not you believe in profit, right? But frankly, it's not in our imagination and ambit. So I think this conversation, in a sense, was conducted by a relatively small elite compared to, in a sense, India's size. And that exclusion has constantly, in some senses, hobbled us, right? I think the second issue on this whole profit sort of business is that, again, I think a little bit of historical perspective, particularly if you look at the 1940s and 1950s, right? And the colonial devastation of the Indian economy was severe, right? I mean, you had practically stagnant, right, growth rates, with, of course, population growth rates rising. So net negative per capita growths, right, for 30, 40, 50 years. Okay? The only experience of capital you had in a social sense was capital, in a sense, exploiting people in the time of distress. If you ask most ordinary people, what do you associate with capital, right, they would have said a sahukar, right? Most of the Indian bourgeoisie that was created in the 1940s, right, was a product of wartime economies, right? I mean, that's what gave the Indian bourgeoisie an opening. Otherwise, the British probably would not even have let that, right? So in those circumstances, it's not easy to imagine, right, what, in a sense, a capital looks like. Post 1991, we began to break that mold. I think the IT industry culturally was very important with that. It convinced the middle class that you could actually make the transition from education to being an entrepreneur without sort of the usual trappings of, historically inherited capital, double crossing sahukars and all of that. There's a huge cultural shift. And I actually think that cultural shift is permanent. I mean, most young people still want to be entrepreneurs. In some sense, a self-employment, which is the ultimate tribute to capital, except that we don't think of it as such, has always been the norm in the Indian economy. So whether or not we tolerate profits is a function of how credible are the institutions through which these profits are generated, right? If these are largely the product of crony capitalism, alliance between states and capital, monopoly power, right? Manipulating regulatory and tariff structures, the social support for capital will diminish, which is basically, again, what began to happen after 2009, right? Once those kind of big factor market corruption scandals broke. Which is why the old adage, right, that to have successful markets, you need a successful state. The way we think of markets is an alternative to state. Actually, that's not, I mean, it's only states that run good regulatory systems that can also run good markets.
Exactly. So just a quick kind of an appendage to this whole, these questions that we've been discussing about whether culturally India romanticizes poverty and the whole civilization story. There's this other belief among some people outside India that India moralizes too much. Indian diplomats talk from a point of view of moral superiority. They talk down on people because we are the wise guys. India wants to be what some people call Vishwa Guru, that we want to be Vishwa Guru. We want to talk down because we know we are the wise old civilization. And that doesn't go down well, especially with other such wise civilizations like our neighbor to the north, who are equally wise and equally long civilization. So is that tone of voice hurting India, or is it a USP, a positioning platform for India?
I mean, Kissinger was never a friend of India, and this foreign policy usually in the 70s, as my friend Gary Bass has shown, was quite tinged with racism, the Kissinger-Nixon period. But he did have this one nice line that India is not the most important country in the world, it's the most self-important country in the world. There is that cliche, I think, in international diplomatic circles. And, at a superficial level, you can see what they have in mind. We are garrulous. We like talking a lot. We like pontificating a lot. I mean, that's one thing that actually gives the civilization a lot of energy in some ways, right? But having said that, I do think that's a very superficial assessment. I think for the most part, given the constraints India faces, right? India's actually on the international stage placed its cards quite well, actually. I think in the 1950s and 60s, even as Jayashankar's book acknowledges, a new book, in the international arena, we probably punched a little bit above our weight. I mean, our problems were more closer home in terms of kind of consolidating our borders and managing the aftermath of the, in the sense, aftermath of the partition. Certainly, Western powers can't complain that India preaches too much. I mean, after all, in some senses, they spearheaded ideologies whose own raison d'etre was preaching to the rest of the world. And so sometimes this argument can also be used as a kind of stratagem in rhetorical and kind of cultural warfare to put India on the defensive. I think the important point, though, I think if you want to take that criticism constructively, is that when you speak and when you promise, you must have something to back it up, right? If you're going and promising your neighbors, right, economic assistance, if you're saying, we'll supply A, B, C, D to you, right? Actions must follow those words. And sometimes that gap, I think, is wider than it should be. But I honestly don't think our natural garrulousness is a really disabling factor in international diplomacy.
Okay, a couple of factors on the other side, or theories or arguments that people put on the other side on why India will be a great power or the great power in the coming century. So on a more positive side, there's a lot of talk always about demographic dividend, that we are a young country, our median age is under 30, half our population is under 25, and therefore we are bound to be great because we have this young, energetic, potential population coming up. And by sheer weight of that population, it will lead to economic benefits. But again, devil's advocate, numbers don't matter. A young population, if that human capital is not managed well, for example, in terms of an education system and a healthcare system. So it's great to have a billion young people, but if those billion young people are not well educated and not healthy, that doesn't help us very much. So is that the demographic dividend working in India's favor, or we have a large population but not well-trained large population, you think?
So, I mean, two things. One, obviously, India's single biggest failure since independence, the most unconscionable, and frankly, there's no excuse across political parties in this, has been the lack of investment in its own people, right? Beginning with Nehru, to be honest. I mean, I think in hindsight, Nehru is accused of every sin these days. But I think our lack of investment in health and education is the single biggest disabler for Indian prospects, right? And the fact that even a very elementary milestone like 100% enrollment, we're just talking enrollment in school, we're not even talking outcomes yet and so forth, right, was achieved only a few years ago, right? It has actually been a kind of, I think, a catastrophe for India. Health similarly, right? I mean, let's not forget the fact that on most vital indicators, there is some good news. Fertility rate is falling. That's and in fact, this is something that goes against what you were suggesting. I think most people are now expecting India's fertility rate and India reaching replacement rate to be much faster than we had anticipated. From one point of view, that's good news. But what it also means that your window of growing rich before you grow old is actually in some senses shorter. It's 15, 20 years. It's not 40, 50 years, right? So time is of the essence. But, morbidity levels in India on basic indicators, right? Infant mortality, maternal mortality, actually we are doing worse than Bangladesh now. Okay? That's the most sobering thing to think about, right? And frankly, those indicators should be the most important indicators we look at when we think of India's success and its achievement as a great power. I mean, it's a nation afflicted by morbidity and a lack of dynamism in education, but having a few nuclear weapons is probably actually the worst of all possible worlds in some ways, right? And those are still not our priorities. I mean, one had hoped that post the pandemic, the shock of the pandemic, the one thing we would get committed to, right, is an extraordinary public health system, right? All the signs are that I think we will do the minimum that is necessary to get by and stave off a political rebellion. But not invest there. Now, I think the only silver lining is that because of a certain kind of entrepreneurialism, people are finding ways to innovate at small and medium levels to kind of bypass this kind of sclerotic public health and public system. But no country in the world that has risen to great power status has risen without success in public health and public education. None. Even the United States, right? I mean, we forget is, public education, despite vast disparities, but public education still remains the mainstay of that system. And post 1991, I think India's elites got it into their head that the process of reform was largely about where do we need to get the state out? Very good question. We needed to get it out of business in large measure, right? No question. And we've succeeded in many areas there. But we never asked the question, where do we need to invest in the state, right? Where it can actually build public systems. And there's still no appetite for that. I mean, the minute the government talks about raising taxes, more public revenue, we'll be the first one to rebel. Simple story. You're not going to build, this is the writing, you're not going to build a robust public system without raising India's tax over GDP ratio. Do you have the political will to do it? Right? Do you care enough about inclusion to do it? Still a big question mark.
This audience made up of almost entirely educators and at least two vice chancellors, current or past. That's quite a self-damning commentary on our education system. So I mean, that's outside the purview of today's discussion, but aren't we collectively as a educator community responsible for that?
Professor Chandra knows this is my favorite hobby horse, so don't give me too much rope on this. No, I think two things quickly. Look, at one level, many of the people around here are examples of what we were just discussing. I mean, I think Ahmedabad University, the transition it's undergoing, is a really hopeful and dynamic example of, what in a sense people are doing outside of the system. I think I'm lucky enough to be in an institution that I think is also trend setting in some ways. But we also have to acknowledge the fact, right, that these individual feats of entrepreneurship are not going to, right, cumulatively add up to the kind of momentum we need without reforming the public system. This government is determined to run JNU in the ground. Believe me, Delhi University, right, will be finished as an intellectual force within the next 2 to 3 years. Okay. So yes, I mean, if a new Ahmedabad University comes up, Ashoka comes up, but you decimate your existing assets, right? How are you going to create the ecosystem that nurtures? And yes, we are responsible. I mean, we are responsible in the sense that if you look at the history of higher education, I mean, the first thing I will say is that yes, politicians intervened at many different levels. The story begins, you can go way back, 1940s, 1960s, different forms of intervention. But the biggest abdications came from us as educators in our communities. I mean, the politicians actually, in a sense, filled the vacuum, right? And we as professionals did not get together and think about what our professional responsibilities and build the kind of collective action that will shape our universities and colleges based on those norms, right? So again, what you're seeing in India is a classic exit solution. Individual entrepreneurs managing to do what they can in their control, but nobody's shedding a tear over JNU, nobody's shedding a tear over Delhi University, nobody's shedding a tear over Bombay University. And I just can't see how you're going to, even in higher education, I'm not even talking about primary yet, but in higher education, going to achieve our goals without this kind of synergy in public-private momentum.
Okay, yeah, as you said, and I said that this was an aside. We could go on, and maybe we'll get you back another time just to talk about higher education in India. But that is not our topic for today. So, coming back on track, one or two last things before we open up to audience questions. One is again one theory that keeps getting bandied around on why India is well suited to be a global power is that India is comfortable with diversity. We are comfortable with pluralism. We are the original multicultural society in terms of ethnic groups and religions and cultures and languages and so on, and we are comfortable with that. We are not a homogeneous country, and that is often bandied around in comparison to China, for example, that China is far more homogeneous and they are not comfortable with diversity. They don't like diversity. They try to beat down any groups that are not don't fit the mold of typical Han Chinese, like the in Xinjiang or in Tibet or wherever, that they are beaten down to become more Chinese. So whatever that means, that India is comfortable with plurality and diversity, and therefore we are well suited to go out and lead a diverse world. Does that hold water, you think?
Uh, it's a very good question. So I think the two ways of thinking about it. So there is no question in my mind that this should be India's biggest asset. India is a Hindu country, it's a Muslim country, it's a Christian country, it's an Enlightenment power in the 18th century sense of Western Enlightenment, it's an Asian power. I think Nehru got that exactly right? Which is, this is the one country which is a kind of palimpsest on which every civilization has not just left its imprint, but as a country, in a sense, it has internalized every civilization, right? It's an extraordinary achievement and extraordinary asset. There are, however, I think three problems with this story. One, even though we are culturally comfortable with this at some level, at a kind of vernacular level, at a theological level, we have been ourselves during the course of the last century, and particularly in the last few years, we are politically a lot more uncomfortable with this story, right? There is a dominant political current that in some senses wants to turn the clock back, whatever that means, right? Which wants to emphatically assert that this is a Hindu civilization. And in some senses, its cultural identity must be defined by whatever this thing we call Hinduness is. And let's not underestimate the political power of that current. That is the ruling dispensation currently, right? Which is okay. The second, I think, worry about this story is when we think of plurality and diversity, we have to think across many dimensions, but two particular dimensions. You can think of it across a cultural dimension, right? And as I said, there we are comfortable in some ways. I mean, just by the force of kind of our history, this assimilation has happened. But there is also a social dimension to it. And the social dimension in the following sense that India allowed every community and every group to become part of itself and find its place, so long as those groups stayed in their place, right? Our cities were geographically divided. If you take caste into this factor, in a sense, insidious form of social toleration, but that is hierarchically organized. Now, one of the challenges of modern society, and this is where I think the contrast between India and China is actually stark. China is culturally more homogeneous, let's posit that, is that modern societies require freedom and equality. These different cultural groups will share the same spaces. You can't segregate them, right? They will work in the same places. They will intermarry, right? the rates of intermarriage in India are still shockingly low, shockingly low, right? And what that suggests that at a deep social level, this diversity is in some senses still relatively compartmentalized, right? Uh, we thought the processes of modernity would unleash forces, right? If you educate people together, if there is economic dynamism, if the association between religion and caste and occupation becomes less pronounced, you actually get, in a sense, people moving, in common spaces. That is happening much less. Not only is it happening much less, you now have a ruling dispensation that actively, that's a code, wants to discourage this. I mean, what is all this love jihad nonsense about? Right? It's a real fear of freedom and equality. And so if you're going to give everybody a stake in this diversity, it has to be done under conditions of individual dignity, freedom, and equality. The third thing to remember, I think, in this, which brings back to the geopolitics of this, is that partition was a big political, social, and cultural trauma for the subcontinent. Not just in terms of the violence that preceded it, accompanied it, and still continues in its wake in both India and Pakistan. But at one level, it was a signal also of a failure of a certain kind, right? The Indian constitutional project is born in the shadow of that failure, where all this kind of cultural discourse around plurality, diversity, if the Gandhis and the Nehrus and all couldn't pull it off, right? The deep disjuncture between that and the politics. What hobbles our great power status and ambitions is the fact that we still have this almost 75, 80-year-old, maybe longer, right? Almost internal kind of civil war in the subcontinent. Pakistan is not a geostrategic problem for us in the conventional sense, right? And it's hard to imagine India acquiring great power status unless it first sorts out a political settlement within its own region, right? Now, unfortunately, the political economy of Pakistan, right, does not permit a kind of sensible resolution for framework for South Asia. Unfortunately, I think the great shadow of partition in some senses still domestic politics, right? In fact, Pakistan is much more of an issue in Indian domestic politics, paradoxically, than India is in Pakistan's domestic politics, right? And outside powers can intervene or destroy the strategic unity of the subcontinent precisely because these conflicts are lingering, right? Nepal, even Nepal now, right? And unless this civilizational connection is translated into a sensible political project, right, that can bring some kind of regional settlement and peace to South Asia, we are always going to be hobbled. So yes, that plurality is an asset. Not only is an asset, it's a moral imperative. I mean, you have to let people free to discover whatever identities they want and wish to have. Right? But it needs to also surmount these challenges.
Exactly. That neatly brings us to where I thought we'll close is to our own backyard. As you said, there are issues with Pakistan and quite obviously, but even more than that, there are issues with Nepal. Who would have thought 20 years ago that we'll have issues with Nepal or Sri Lanka or Maldives and so on? So in India, that whatever we call it, the colonial hangover, that in the colonial times, India was the jewel in the crown, and we were like the pride of the Raj. And we thought that we will be the pride of this region. Everyone from Afghanistan to Burma, at least, if not beyond, would be under India's wing. But we have lost most of that. We have let our backyard slip out of our fingers. And now China with its huge infrastructure projects in Pakistan and Nepal and Sri Lanka, building ports and railways and highways, is India is now kind of completely encircled by Chinese economic power in its own backyard. So we've kind of lost that hegemony, at least in the region that we thought we inherited, because we were the dominant power in South Asia in the British times. Which brings me to my last question. I'm sure there'll be many more things to discuss in the remaining 30 minutes, but from my side, we have skirted around the elephant in the room, or the dragon in the room, as we can call it, China. China has been kind of a shadow for a long time, and we have gone through waves. People, maybe not our students, but people of a certain vintage will remember a period in the early 2000s where there was this bromance between India and China, and there were these cute words used like Chindia, where it was believed that China and India kind of complement each other, and we together can face off the Western world. And it is Chindia's. I have not seen the word Chindia in the last 5 or 6 years at least. So is that bromance dead now, or is there a divorce in the offing?
No, no. I mean, look, it's obviously dead and buried at the moment. I mean, and and I think there's a, you know, look, China is complicated. I mean, I think the way our knowledge of China and our investment in knowledge about China has been woefully inadequate, given that this is going to be probably arguably the most important relationship for the 21st century, one way or the other. I mean, whether it goes well or badly, but for India, the most consequential relationship. But I think but there are two lessons, I think, from this sort of up and down in our relationship with China. One is that internal regime type hugely matters to foreign policy. The fact of the matter is the Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin years, China was opening up not just externally, but there was a fair degree of internal loosening of the political system as well. I mean, frankly, our experience of going to China used to be very different. You could go to a university like Tsinghua or Beida, and actually you felt, you could be any place in the world, extraordinary universities, and you spoke freely to colleagues, right? With Xi Jinping, you've had extraordinary, even by Chinese standards, I'm not saying the Chinese were never authoritarian, but even by Chinese standards, an extraordinary concentration of power and the building of a surveillance state that's unprecedented, right? We know two things, right, historically, that deeply authoritarian and centralizing regimes almost always, right, pose challenges for everybody around them. One, because there are limits to how much they can engage with you in an open system, because they're fearful of their own power. And second, they are wedded to a project of even deeper homogenization, as China is carrying out now in the most brutal and insidious ways in Xinjiang, right? But that project by its very nature entails, right, that pretty much everybody in the world then is looked on with paranoid suspicion. So my own sense is that, look, the nature of this relationship is less going to be determined by what we do. I mean, we obviously have to now ensure that we have all the resilience and all the strategic tools we need, right, to weather the storm. But it is going to fundamentally depend on how China evolves internally. I mean, that is actually, in some senses, the real driver of this relationship, right? But it's also a lesson for us, which is how our neighbors will pursue us, will perceive us, right? Whether we feel threatening or not, will also depend on the nature of our political system as it evolves.
Yeah, very true. I know we are overshooting, and I can see the chat box kind of exploding on the scenes. There's a lot of questions coming up there, so we'll get to that in a moment. But I can't resist asking one last thing. Is that a lot of people say that in terms of GDP and military firepower and economics and so on, India will take decades, if not centuries, to come to par with China or the US. So India's only hope is in its soft power and IPL and Bollywood and yoga, and India can become a soft power rather than try to become a hard power. And in these days of IPL, do you think that kind of soft power will take India far?
So two things. One, I think soft power is one of the most misunderstood and abused terms in international relations. First of all, the most important feature of soft power is you don't aim at producing it. It happens because you produce things that are culturally credible, right? If you have a great higher education system, people want to come and study, right? It's not that you go around saying, this is, if you say it's part of our soft power, you've already destroyed the credibility of that project, right? If you have well functioning, why do people invest in the US, right? Why does US have the dollar advantage? In part because there was some kind of faith in the institutional capacity of the Federal Reserve and a certain sense of transparency and accountability about that system, right? So soft power is not an objective. It can't be an objective. In fact, it's self-defeating to think of it's an objective. It's a product of you doing lots of things that you have intrinsic reason to do, right? And hope that they are credible and attractive enough for people. Second, and I think this is that the issue is not sort of catching up or not catching up. One of the big lessons of 20th centuries, right? I mean, it depends what your objective is. If you want enough power to cause chaos and disrupt things in the world, right? I mean, Osama bin Laden managed to bring about a much bigger strategic shift than any country ever did, right? But it's entirely negative. It's entirely destructive in some ways, right? Small states, Cuba managed to fend off the United States for years and years, right? In your local context, you can actually be, in some senses, a big power, right? And yet not be able to solve small problems, right? I mean, one of the paradoxes of the United States is great power, particularly in the second half of the last 20th century, right? There isn't a war that the United States has been able to really win, right? Okay. Because it's in a sense not about military capabilities, right? It's about the democratic consensus that goes behind those decisions, right? All of that. So this obsession with power is a self-defeating obsession. The only question we need to ask is, what are the things that are important for you to do to make sure that every Indian has a stake in the development of this country, right? And as I said, internally, the country is governed by some basic core constitutional values. If you do that, you will have all the power in the world anyway, right? There have been very small countries that have punched above their weight. There have been very large countries with all the, I mean, take Russia, for instance, right? It is a significant power. But right now, it's a significant power largely in a veto and destructive sense. It can block things from happening in the world, right? Okay. So I think on this, Deng Xiaoping was right, which is, keep a cool head and concentrate on your development, and then, power will come automatically.
Yeah, examples of South Korea or Taiwan punching way above their weight, both in terms of hard economic power as well as K-pop and all the soft power that goes with K-pop. Okay, so it looks like we will shoot past hour 5:30. p.m. Deadline by 5 or 10 minutes. If Pratap, if you are okay to stay
Yeah,
on
that's
for
fine. That's fine.
extra 5 or 10 minutes, we are happy to stay all night if you want, but we'll just take 5 or 10 minutes extra. So before I open the floodgates of the questions in the chat box, Pankaj, you are still here. Pankaj, can I bring you in on the condition that the two vice chancellors will not talk about higher education, but stay on the India's great power and foreign policy? You have some comments to add or questions to ask?
No, after once Pratap speaks, everybody just, and especially me, I sits in such a amazing fascination of the erudition and his analysis that I have very little really to say, and I really enjoyed every bit, as I've always done when Pratap speaks. But there's just one thought that was coming to my mind was, I believe the idea of India has to be its own. I doubt very much, and this is my take from a little bit from what Pratap has been saying. I think the secretary of India will have to be its own to be able to meet the aspirations of our own people, diverse as it is, and to take advantage of every bit of it with equality and freedom. Feeling this centralizing regime, they can come every better place to live in. Economically, perhaps, but socially and culturally and mentally, I think it's going to be very path we do in the future in many ways. Either
Pankaj, we are losing your audio. So, Pratap, based on whatever you could catch, can you respond while we'll get Pankaj back again, maybe in a few minutes?
Yeah, Pankaj, we lost you for a second, so I didn't hear your last sentence. But I'm interpreting your question whichever way. So I agree with Pankaj. I think on the fundamental and important point that he made, that whatever story we're going to script for ourselves has to be in some senses our story. And I think at three different levels. Our one, taking into account the totality of conditions that we are confronting here. And those are in some senses unique. We have a lot to learn from other places, but our economic, social, and cultural predicament is unique. It will have to be our own in the sense that it will have to take on board and be sensitive to the cultural idioms in which we express this story. Everybody needs to feel that this story is their story, all sections of Indian society, right? And I think that has been one, failure, of the kind of elite idea of India project, that at some level, I think normatively and constitutionally, it's a very defensible project. But there is no question that large sections felt it was not their project. And just put it in a very quotidian way. It's an issue that bothers me a lot, particularly North India and Pankaj's home state, is, for example, the marginalization of Hindi. Now, one part of the criticism of the Hindi establishment was valid, which is there should be no project of imposing Hindi on any part of the country. Absolutely spot on. India should not repeat the mistake Sri Lanka and so forth made. But you've also ended up a situation where a large swath from, Rajasthan to Calcutta and everything in between feels culturally deeply marginalized by the dominant idioms in which our arguments are constructed. And this is not true of many other legal languages. I think there's a complicated sociology to this, right? But if you reach a point where you kind of convince people that, look, Hindi is not a language of knowledge production, that you will be at a systematic disadvantage. And look, you're talking of 300 million people here. A lot of the kind of politics of resentment that you are seeing is actually, in a sense, a disguised expression of this kind of failure of inclusion in some ways. Right? So it will not only have to be, in a sense, our idiom, it will have to be connected in diverse ways where everybody feels that it is their idiom.
Sudhir, I'm sure we'll not get through all those questions, but can you start us off with some questions?
So there is one question that because most of the questions in the conversation, it has been partly answered. But there is one question that I'm very keen to take on is by Saurabh Goel. He's saying that, do you think that the current reality of communal disharmony, mutual suspicion, and disapproval of our academia is a manufactured idea by politics? Or there is something real that resonates and gives these ideas a ground in our society?
Oh, a very good question. So I think a couple of things, Saurabh, about this. Look, one, in some senses, in any democratic society, politics does matter. And as we were discussing in relationship to partition and South Asia, one of the mistakes we often make is this kind of deep disjuncture between culture and politics, right? So culturally, we say we are comfortable with plurality. In politics, we aren't. What, in a sense, brings the two together. But I have to say, and India is not unique in this. I mean, any nation state that has gone through the process of nation state formation, by the very logic of what nation state entails, does so with incredible and immense conflict. I mean, in fact, India's record is actually arguably somewhat better. If you look at Europe, for example, I mean, in a sense, Europe, violently conducted a project of homogenization. Late 19th century Europe, as empires gave way to nation states everywhere, right? There was immense conflict. Partitions, yes, colonial powers, but partitions happened everywhere as well, right? Including, I mean, Britain couldn't solve Ireland, for example, just to take a much smaller example. So one thing, at one level, I think we need to look at that comparative history of nation state formation and ask a question: why is it that all processes of nation state formation have been accompanied by this deep internal disharmony and violence? And draw the right lesson, which is, if that is the case, do we need a slightly different and imaginative model of a different kind of nation state? And frankly, one of India's uniqueness was that it was thinking on those lines. For example, the way we resolved the language question, absolutely unprecedented in thinking about nation states, right? That you could, with 19 official languages, run together this project, right? In fact, it's something the EU has to catch up to. So that's, I think, at a very general level, what India is experiencing is not unique. It's. But I think at this moment, frankly, there is a level of poison in our system that is absolutely unprecedented in the last 20, 30 years. So let's for a moment admit that there are some genuine disputes, right? We can argue that the constitutional promise of the Indian state was unevenly applied in the 70 years since independence. There's lots of festering political issues around, let's say, personal law, lots of festering issues around control of temples, these are disputes. I mean, they come partly from the burden of this 5,000-year civilization that Raviji was talking about, right? So let's not deny the existence of those disputes. Let's also not deny the existence of disputes over contested memory. was Mughal India a experiment in social harmony, or was it driven by deep conflict? Now, arguably it was both, right? But our historical memory is also deeply contested. I think all of that is fair enough. And what we needed was a politics that patiently works through these disputes. There will be naturally disagreements in politics. I mean, there's no question, as they are in academia. I think what we are witnessing at this moment is something much darker and insidious than your standard communal politics of difference. We are normalizing hate, right? Uh, the kind of frank prejudice that can be expressed in elite circles, right? Which violates a basic cardinal tenet of democracy, which is you should not and cannot target people because of the groups to which they belong. That taboo is being not just broken, but now legitimized at the highest circles of political power. And that's a big difference, right? Look, we always play politics with identities, there's always been part. But the idea that you constitutionalize and normalize prejudice and hate, right? And I think this prejudice and hate now has almost got an autonomous dynamic to it, which is what worries me. These disagreements that I talked about, these have become pretexts and excuses for that hate. They're not explanations for that hate. It's almost like if you resolve one dispute, you will go for the next one. Ayodhya is done, now let's move on to Kashi Mathura. You know, this never-ending escalatory ladder of tests. So we have to squarely confront the fact that this hate, and this is not just generated in politics. Politics exacerbates it by normalizing it, and when the top leaders of the country, in some senses, give a green signal that this is okay to do, people who engage in this are politically rewarded, that's a political problem. But it is happening in civil society as well. I mean, it's happening in families, it's happening in private associations, right? And I think we have to just very bluntly call it out for what it is. All the other explanations, this is because of pseudo-secularism of Congress. Agreed, Congress was pseudo-secularism. But the vehemence and depth of this is not explained by normal political disagreements.
Sudhir, can I pick up something now that you have opened this floodgate of talking about identity politics and insidiousness of the current nationalism, jingoism? There's a question from Amol Agarwal, Professor Amol Agarwal, on isn't the 2020s starting to look quite like the 1920s? Coming out of a pandemic and getting into fascism in a few countries in Europe, and so are we repeating 1920s?
That's a very good analogy, and you actually don't have to look at Europe, right? So I would say there are 4 ways in which I worry that we are closer to 1920s and 30s. So one is, of course, the comparison. Will there be an economic crisis? And as many of you seem a lot more optimistic about the Indian economy in the poll, we may actually do okay. I mean, I do think there is enough sort of entrepreneurship, resilience in the Indian economy. We may not do 8%, but we could go back up to 5-7%. Will it be enough to sustain a vibrant social contract? I don't know. But the more important sense, right? One, if you compare with Weimar Germany, one of the most important crises of Weimar Germany was the crisis of constitutionalism. Right? I teach constitutional law. It's one of my areas of research interest. And today, when I walk into a class on constitutional law, I cannot tell you what the Constitution of India is. I honestly cannot. I used to think a constitution protects habeas corpus, that elemental cornerstone of any constitution. Can you be detained without, legitimate hearing expectation? Completely gone. Okay. Separation of powers gone. The Supreme Court, you might as well give up on. There are a few high courts that are still bravely passing interesting orders. Maybe that will be a source of resistance. So let's not pretend. I don't know what the Indian Constitution is. I cannot tell you with a straight face. The Indian Constitution says this is what will predict what will happen in the Supreme Court. Okay. So there is a deep crisis of that basic framework, which is, even part from identity. The second, and there the analogy with, I think, India in the 1930s is interesting, is remember what happened in India in the 1930s, right? You had the early success of the Congress Party. You have this absolutely extraordinary generation of nationalist leaders, right? Who are trying to define a new idea of India, right? And ideologically the most articulate, sophisticated, imaginative you can imagine. I mean, you still read that generation and you say, geez, we produce people like this across the spectrum. I mean, and yet, the full might of that entire generation could not prevent the poisoning of Indian politics that took place in the 1930s and 1940s, right? Okay. I think we need to ask the question why. I mean, if Nehru, Gandhi, Patel, Azad, Subramanian Bharati, whoever, right, M.N. Roy, whichever spectrum, could not halt that tide, do we think with a political leadership across the political spectrum less committed, right, to that idea, palimpsest idea of India can actually pull it off? And it's the same civil society dynamics, right? Organizations spreading hate. Now you have this absolutely insidious alliance between Indian capital and the politics of hate. Let's be very clear about it. Part of this is being manufactured by a new information order, social media, which is obviously not in people's control, but also other kinds of order, right? There is a whole ecosystem sustaining this, right? When your nightly information order is basically a call for a lynch mob, it's in a sense the 1930s. I mean, it's like, Arnab calling for direct action almost every day. Okay? So the 1930s in India is very important for us, right? Are we repeating that same dynamic all over? And frankly, all the arguments look pretty much the same, right? What were the arguments there? Cow protection, temple, right? Are Muslims patriotic? I mean, it's how can you be a great power if you're stuck in the 1930s, right? So I think your question is, analogy spot on. And the third thing with worries is, as I said, which is with possibly even more concentration of power than was possible in the 1930s.
We are past 5:30, so we are now running on borrowed time. So we can't hold Pratap hostage for forever. So I think we'll need to start combining questions. So a couple of questions, mainly from Professor Jimal Unni and Professor Sonal Yadav, on the theme of how do you reconcile becoming a superpower when there is such a lack of social justice and inequality and poverty? So isn't there a contradiction between trying to be a great power but not fixing basics like poverty and inequality and social injustice?
No, I mean, I think that's exactly the right point to be made. I mean, and as I said, even in the case of soft power, which is power is a consequence of things you do. It's not something you aim at. And the enduring source of national power has always been the quality of your human capital, but also the structures of inclusion and negotiation. If America declines tomorrow, right, or what disables America from action, it is going to be its own internal failures of inclusion and its internal divisions. We have those across all different dimensions, right? So I would agree with Professor Unni and Professor Yadav, that our best foreign policy is that domestic objective. You achieve that, almost everything else follows. If you don't achieve that, it doesn't matter what else you do.
Okay, another combined question from at least two people I noticed, from Amol Agarwal again and Arhan Vora and maybe one or two others, is questioning the basic premise of our discussion. Why do we even want to be a great power? Isn't it more important to be a happy country rather than a great country? Some examples given in those questions is like Switzerland or the Nordic countries. Why don't we just aim to be a happy country and not a great power?
Look, I'm very sympathetic to that. I mean, as I said, I am always puzzled by this phrase "great power." I take the ultimate standard of greatness to be a very simple question: which society allows most of its citizens to live life with dignity and participate in collective decision making freely? That's because those are two very important ingredients of happiness in some ways, right? Um, it's true. I mean, in a certain way, I mean, if you're being hearted about it, you could say, look, India doesn't have the Norway Switzerland option. Because of its size, its neighborhood. I mean, whether we like it or not, if India is successful, it will have a large footprint on the world, right? Just by sheer numbers. And when you have a large footprint on the world, certain kinds of responsibilities and challenges come with managing it. So in that sense, we cannot be a sort of Switzerland or a Norway, Norway, small country, strikes it rich with oil, those kinds of things, Remember, Switzerland also survives only because there was a great power compact that we needed a few of these small havens to launder our money for, the longest time. India will not have that option. But I think the spirit of the question is I think is exactly right, which is that if you aim at a happy and decent society, right, everything else will follow, and that should be our aim.
Sudhir, you picked up anything else you want to ask, or?
We have answered almost all the questions, even during the conversation and after that. So, if you have
Pankaj
something
or
closing
Pratap,
remark or
have
something.
you noticed anything directly in the chat, or are we done? Okay, if we are done, I will, because he who holds the mic holds the question. So let me force the last question. In the next 4 days, we will know, or maybe we will not know, who's going to be the next president of the United States. More disturbing would be if we don't know. But if we know who's going to be the next president, how does that affect India's trajectory in the coming decades?
No, see, if you take a longer term time horizon, the dynamics of these relationships are actually driven by a lot of structural factors. And I think there are 3 or 4 basic things that I think are going to points of continuity. I think so long as the China factor remains a factor in world politics in the way it is, there is going to be a growing convergence of India, US, not just India, US. Right now, it's India and the rest of the world's interest, frankly, right? I mean, there's a small list of countries that boycotted, Liu Xiaobo's Nobel Prize ceremony. That, if you take away that set of countries, Pakistan, North Korea, pretty much everybody else, I think, is in a sense on the same page. I think the second thing we in a sense have to be prepared for, which is obvious, which is no matter which political party is in the power in the US, it is actually going to look after the United States' interests first and foremost. And frankly, even the global open international order was sustained so long as the United States thought it served its interests, right? And so on that front, I think the whole global economy is in a complex period of negotiation, which is not going to change, irrespective of, I think, Trump or Biden. One thing that will change at the margins is that because of Trump, the norms in the international system had become such that frankly, any country could get away with anything without pretty much any reputational damage. I mean, if you wanted to be part of the big boys club, right? In fact, I think Trump's questions to us would be, why aren't you doing more of this bad stuff, right? So at the margins, I think the quality of Indian democracy is going to be a little bit more of a discussion point if Biden wins. There is no question about it. No question about it. And we've also not sort of, I think, handled it well, right? Partly because the global norm is again going to change. At least the United States is not going to go around and says anything goes. Okay? Will it actually make a deep difference on the ground? I actually don't think so. What will make a difference at the end of the day is the United States is going to just look at one number, which is what is your rate of growth? If American businesses see a future in India, right, it's going to overcome almost all of these other uncertainties and anxieties. So let's concentrate on the basics. Not worry too much about the sort of the short-term perceptions.
Okay, great. I think we have over exploited your generosity in time, Pratap. So, Pankaj, any last word before I hand it back to Sudhir to close?
No, just thank you very much. There's one lesson that I always take back when Pratap speaks, and that is, to really ask this question always, which is a contested question in term, and we've been thinking about it in the context of education, but Pratap so nicely puts it in the context of the country and the world. The question becomes, who makes the choices? And I think are those choices covering everybody who is a stakeholder in the system will actually define how we are going to progress. So absolutely fabulous. And thank you very much, Pratap, for your time. As always, you've been very generous with us all the time.
Thank you all, and hope our paths can cross in person soon.
Yes, we will do that.
We'll do that. We'll do that.
Thank you so much. We couldn't have asked for a more better weekend, Saturday evening than this. Thank you so much for doing this. I have already started receiving congratulatory emails and messages for organizing this session. And I'm thankful to everybody, those who joined us. Take very good care of yourself and see you on next Saturday with a new speaker. Thank you so much for this.